Have you ever been reading the Old Testament and just found yourself scratching your head? I mean, one minute it's laying down this profound moral command like do not murder, and then the next it's talking about why you shouldn't eat pork or get certain kinds of tattoos. It can feel, well, a little all over the place. So let's just get right into the heart of it, because this is the question, isn't it? How can someone chow down on a shrimp cocktail without a second thought, but then hold super firmly to a rule about adultery that's sometimes in the very same book? To an outsider, it looks like people are just picking and choosing what they want to follow. But you know, what's really interesting is that this isn't some new complaint people came up with last week. This apparent inconsistency is a classic puzzle. Theologians and thinkers have been wrestling with it for centuries. And it turns out there's a pretty well-established key to making sense of it all. The root of the whole puzzle is right here. The Old Testament law, which was given specifically to the ancient nation of Israel, is this huge collection of rules. It's got everything from these massive, universal moral principles like do not steal, to really specific cultural regulations about, say, not mixing linen and wool in your clothes, or what to do if your ox scores your neighbor. It's the whole shebang. So, how do we solve this? How do we untangle it all? Well, like I said, brilliant people have been working on this for a long, long time, and they developed a powerful framework to crack this very code. And the solution really comes down to understanding one core idea. Not all laws were created equal or for the same purpose. Theologians traditionally sort them into three distinct categories. All right, this slide right here, this is the key that unlocks the entire puzzle. This is the decoder ring. The idea is that Old Testament laws can be sorted into moral, ceremonial, and judicial buckets. And the absolutely crucial distinction, the one that answers our shellfish question, is that only the moral law is considered universally and timelessly binding for Christians. Okay, first up, we have the moral law. Think of the big ones. The 10 Commandments are the perfect example. We're talking about laws against things like murder, theft, and lying. The idea here is that these laws are binding on everyone, everywhere, at all times, because they reflect something called natural law. That's just the concept that some moral truths are kind of baked into the universe and are obvious to all of us through reason. We all instinctively know that murder is just plain wrong. Next, you've got the ceremonial law. Now, this is where you find all those rules about animal sacrifices, dietary restrictions like not eating pork, and all the specific religious festivals. These laws were given to ancient Israel to organize their worship and to make them culturally distinct from their neighbors. Theologically, they're seen as temporary shadows or symbols that were pointing forward to the coming of Jesus. And finally, there's the judicial law. Honestly, the easiest way to think about this is that it was the civil legal code for the nation of Israel back then. It covered things like specific penalties for crimes, property disputes, and basically how to run their society. And just like the legal code of ancient Rome isn't binding on Canada today, these laws were specific to that nation at that time. Okay, so we've got our three neat categories: moral, ceremonial, and judicial. It's a great theory, but is there any actual biblical evidence for dividing the laws this way? Let's take a look at the New Testament and see if the authors were thinking along these same lines. And the answer is a pretty clear yes. Just look at this quote from the Apostle Paul. He is explicitly telling the early Christians, hey, don't let anyone give you a hard time about rules related to food, drink, or religious festivals. What are those? Those are all classic examples from the ceremonial law. This just illustrates the point perfectly. The argument in the New Testament is that these ceremonial laws did their job. They were the shadows, the previews, but now Christ, the reality they pointed to, has arrived. It's why Mark's gospel can just casually note that Jesus declared all foods clean, basically closing the book on that whole ceremonial dietary code. Okay, but what about the moral law? Does that get tossed out too? Absolutely not. In fact, the New Testament doubles down on it. Here, Paul lists a whole series of actions: theft, adultery, idolatry, that are straight out of the Old Testament's moral code. And he says in no uncertain terms that people who live this way won't inherit the kingdom of God. So you see the clear distinction they're making. It's crucial. While those ceremonial laws are set aside as fulfilled, the core moral commands are brought forward and reaffirmed. They aren't treated as temporary or symbolic. They're treated as timeless truths that are absolutely essential. And that brings us to the biggest challenge to this whole framework. It's an argument I am sure you've heard before. It's often called the shellfish objection. And here's the argument, laid out plain and simple. A critic will point to the book of Leviticus and say, hang on, in this book, there's a ban on eating shellfish. But in the very same book, there are prohibitions on certain sexual acts. So, if you're going to dismiss the food law as outdated, isn't it totally inconsistent to uphold the sexual law? Aren't you just picking and choosing your morals? It's a fair question. So theologians respond by looking even closer at the text itself to find the context clues. First, they look at the nature of the act. Is eating shrimp something that's intrinsically wrong, like murder, or was it a rule about ritual purity for a specific group? Second, they ask if the law was meant for everyone. The text itself condemns other nations for moral violations like incest, but it never condemns them for eating pork, which shows some laws were seen as universal and others weren't. And third, they look at the punishment. Violating a food law didn't get you the death penalty, but major moral crimes did, signaling a massive difference in severity. So, we've gone through all this trouble sorting laws into different buckets. Why? Why does this three-part distinction actually matter so much? Well, it's because this ancient framework is way more than just a tool for sorting old rules. It provides a consistent logic. It's the answer to that pick-and-choose problem. It also upholds that bigger idea of a universal natural law, a standard of right and wrong that applies to everyone. And it helps clarify what Christianity means by a salvation apart from works of the law. It's talking about freedom from those ceremonial and civil codes, not from basic morality itself. It shows how Christ could fulfill the old law while establishing a new one. So when you boil it all down, this structure isn't about finding loopholes or trying to ignore rules we just don't like. It's a key to understanding an ancient text on its own terms, to see its purpose, its audience, and its place in a much larger story. And it leaves us with one final thought to chew on. How does understanding this structure change the way you see these kinds of texts?